Great. All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to, on this beautiful sunny afternoon in New York, glad to have everybody here. Sunny guys. Sheena Greitens. I gotta get the last name. Greitens. All right. In addition to having a Harvard PhD and being a professor at the University of Missouri, she is the wife of the governor of Missouri. But most importantly, she is a public intellectual of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, which means she has gone through the most rigorous screening process known to academics who work on China and become a public intellectual. And it's terrific that you're fulfilling that responsibility by being here and educating us on a subject that has a lot of heat, a lot of smoke, but not much light. It's one which is often discussed, but rarely is there any data, and rarely do people know about what they're talking about. But she has got both this book. It sounds like a very scary book, though, as I was looking at it, with a somewhat scary cover. Dictators and Their Secret Police: Coercive Institutions and State Violence, which was published last year, and then a forthcoming paper, which is Rethinking China's Coercive Capacity, an analysis of PRC domestic spending from 1992 to 2012. Again, both subjects where we see a lot, but there's very little analysis and very little data. So we're thrilled to have you here. Thank you so much for coming. And talk for 20, 30 minutes. Okay. And then we'll pepper you with questions.
Sounds
but
wonderful.
Thanks for coming from Missouri.
First of all, thank you very much for having me. I had a terrific experience as a public intellectual fellow with the National Committee, and so it's especially fun for me to be able to be here this afternoon to do this talk. And it's a subject that we've all read a fair amount probably about in the news, or at least seen a catchy headline, but that I think there hasn't been a lot of actual data on. And so, most of you in 2011, 2012, 2013 probably saw a headline somewhere that looks a little bit like this: that China was spending more money on internal security than it was on external defense. Here's another headline from a similar news outlet. I could probably put up 12 or 15 of these screenshots without a lot of difficulty. It's got a lot of media attention. And I was really interested in what was going on with these numbers, right? Generally the implication was, wow, this means China's spending a lot. And the way that a lot of academics interpreted that, if you go and you look at the academic literature, was that China's coercive capacity was really strong, that China was really, really capable of policing. That's how people sort of interpreted that number. And you can see where journalists and the folks who were writing these stories, you can see where they got that. If you just graph the total amount of domestic security spending as it's released in official Chinese yearbooks or the reports to the National People's Congress every year, this is what the chart looks like. And you see basically an exponential rise in domestic security spending from 92 to 2012. And I should note, the graphs that you'll see here do stop in 2012. I think that's actually a really nice endpoint to the data for a couple of reasons that I'll come to at the end, because I think it actually helps us understand how the leadership that came in 2012 in that transition, what they were seeing in terms of domestic security in China. And I think it actually helps us explain what we've seen in the past 4.5 or 5 years in terms of the CCP's behavior on domestic security issues, right? So this looks like a really dramatic rise. Here's the potential issue with that, and there are three sort of big interpretive problems with just looking at that one graph and drawing your conclusions from that. The first is that these numbers get taken out of context. There's no way to compare them to know if this is normal compared to other countries, compared to China's own history. There's no way to really interpret what's going on here. In military analysis, there are these volumes that are about this thick that give you the breakdown on military spending. There's one from SIPRI in Stockholm. There's one, this is the military balance that comes out of London every year. Really detailed military budget data. And that just doesn't exist for the domestic security budget. So it makes it really hard to figure out if what China is doing is normal or not. But the headlines portray it as really extraordinary and exceptional. The other thing is that neither the military analysis on China's defense spending nor these stories on the domestic security budget are consistent about what is domestic spending versus external defense spending. And this matters for two reasons. So the top photo is of the People's Armed Police. And a lot of the debate about whether China is accurately reporting its military spending hinges on or rests at least half of the discrepancy in estimates of Chinese defense spending comes from whether or not you include the People's Armed Police. And typically the people who say China is underreporting its defense spending think that the People's Armed Police should count. Chinese statistical yearbooks treat the People's Armed Police as domestic. And many of you in this room probably know that the People's Armed Police evolved in part as a force to handle domestic contingencies and to free the PLA to deal with external defense. But a lot of the time it gets treated as an external defense force. On the other hand, you all probably have seen pictures of ships like this in the news recently. These are some of the law enforcement vessels that are responsible for or involved in some of the disputes that you may have heard about in places like the South China Sea or the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. Anybody know budgetarily where these ships show up in China's budget process?
Domestic.
Maritime enforcement.
Sort of. They're under the State Oceanic Administration, which doesn't show up in the domestic security budget and doesn't show up in the external defense budget. I've never seen any sort of line item from the Ministry of Fisheries that gets counted in either the defense or the domestic security budget. This means that we're, when we do these analyses, like the numbers that we're attaching significance to don't count the actors that have been arguably some of the most significant foreign policy players in China in the last 5 to 10 years. So this just doesn't make a lot of sense. The third problem with the way that these numbers...
under the Ministry of Fisheries?
The state, no, sorry. There's a separate law enforcement force in the period prior to 2012 that's also involved in these disputes that is under the Ministry of Fisheries, in addition to the State Oceanic Administration. Correct. Yeah, and it also does not show up in either budget unless you actively import that data. Which typically is not the way the numbers are aggregated. The other issue is that, a lot of this spending, when you read this number about China spends more on domestic security than external defense, the implication here is that China is spending all of that money on political policing. That this is, this spending is being directed at efforts to deal with or mitigate political opposition to the CCP. If you look at the reporting, it often talks about the rise in protest, sort of what the leadership is worried about in Xinjiang or Tibet. The implication is that this spending, there's never any indication that it deals with anything other than political opposition. And if you actually look, and I'll show you the numbers so you can see them in just a minute, if you actually look at what this budget covers, it covers the entire political legal system, which includes the courts, the sort of ordinary police officers, the prosecutorial system. It includes elements of China's political system that would still require personnel and budgetary support if the PRC became a sort of quintessential liberal democracy tomorrow. So the budget, if we want to think about the effectiveness of this spending, we have to think about the fact that it's dealing both with ordinary law enforcement and with political policing. So the paper basically makes the argument that rather than just looking at that total exponential graph, what we should look at is what China spends the money on, but we should do it in context. We should think about how does this compare to other countries and sort of over time. And that we should also look at what that money is actually getting spent on and what it's being spent against. In other words, what are the challenges that that spending is having to address or is being deployed to address. So those are the three things I'm going to walk through in the next 15 or so minutes before Steve cuts me off.
No.
So this is that graph again about what China spends total. You just take the aggregate figure that gets released annually, put it in a spreadsheet, and that's what you get. This also would suggest, most of us read these numbers and think, okay, this is increasingly important to China. But it turns out that if you look at the percent of the total expenditure or total amount budgeted, China's domestic security spending is not consuming an increasing percentage of resources. The country is not taking money away from anything else to pay for domestic security, according to the budget figures. In fact, if you graphed the entire budget in almost any category, it would look like that. The exponential rise for spending on social services would actually be a little steeper because social services, broadly defined, are consuming an increasing percentage of China's budget. And that's just not necessarily what you would assume from this sort of single category focus on the rise in domestic security.
And if it was defense spending, how would the graph look?
If
that graph was overlaid on defense, would it look the same?
It would also look sort of similarly exponential. So, and notice here also, in some ways I exaggerated the variation. This graph only goes from 0% to about 8% of the budget. So, you're talking about between 5 and 7% of the total budget of the PRC, and you can see that actually from about 2007, 2008 to 2012, precisely the period when the media was reporting these dramatic double-digit increases, that the percentage of total Chinese spending on domestic security was actually going down as a percentage of the budget. Again, this just isn't what you would assume from these super dramatic headlines. So here's what China, category-wise, what it spends on. And the million-dollar question is, do you have a way to separate political policing from law enforcement? And the answer is no. Not the way these budget statistics are categorized. You could try to do it on a local level. I've seen some analyses of a single police station's budget, but there's a lot of internal variation in China, and it's not clear that any one police station's budget would be representative. Overall, what we know is, so this graph takes out the Ministry of Public Security, which is about 60% of that spending in every year from 92 to 2012. Once you take that out, you can actually see a little more what the money is being spent on and how some of it's changed over time. So you can see that the amount spent on courts has risen slightly. The amount spent on the People's Armed Police has also risen. But the amount spent on labor and prison and labor reform has actually declined. And this is actually before the abolishment of the system, which occurred after the break point. These data only go to 2009.
Sheena, it may be hard for people to read that. Could you just tell us what the lines are?
Sure, sorry.
Maybe in the lights in the front,
Steve, I'm going to come over
so
by
that'd be
you.
easier to read that through.
So this
I
line
can't get
here
it.
is prison and labor reform. Here goes down to the middle there. The triangle line is the amount spent on courts.
Yeah.
The squares are the prosecutorial system. This is the Ministry of Justice, National Security, and then People's Armed Police. Other is this, toward the end you start getting these smaller miscellaneous categories like protection of state secrets and a few other things. So national security.
What's national security?
So that includes the state security budget.
So that's Ministry of State Security. And
Yes, although Ministry of State Security also shows up other places in the budget. This is this is explained to be the fraction of that's devoted to domestic questions.
And the Ministry of Public Security, if it were on there, would be a constant?
It would be relatively constant
At a
and
much
it'd be
higher level.
way
Yeah,
up
right.
there. So this maxes out at 15%. Everything other than the Ministry of Public Security is below 15% of the budget. The Ministry of Public Security is total about 60%. between 58% in some years to just over 60% in the highest years.
Well, the one thing that jumps out is the Wuji, the People's Armed Police,
Mm-hmm.
just going up astronomically.
Yeah, and that's probably
It's quintuple.
from sort of about 1% to about 5%.
Yeah.
The People's Armed Police has expanded staffing and the budget, probably also some equipment inlay there. But yes, yeah. So here's the question. Do we want to keep the lights off or on?
Oh,
Off? Okay. What I wanted to do was think about, if you put this in comparative perspective, what would you find? So I picked two countries that were, a liberal democracy, and if you're thinking about Russia, a sort of semi-democracy in the period that we're talking about here. I give you the the left-hand column is the defense spending, official defense budget. This is the figure for 2013. I checked it over a whole range of about 10 years, and the numbers are relatively constant. What you find here, the overall conclusions are very similar. You can see here, yes, China has spent more on internal security, that second column, than it did on external defense by about $4 billion that year. The United States spent about $526 billion on defense spending, but it spent about $155 billion on the same categories, if you counted those as one internal security budget, which in a federal democratic system is not how we do that budgeting. So it's adding up the Department of Homeland Security, portions of the Justice Department that deal with national and domestic security. It adds up state and local police department spending. And it's actually a very complicated comparison. I can get into a little more detail on how I constructed that estimate. But if anything, this is an underestimate of American spending. And then just sort of, because I thought, okay, well, what you're trying to do with this spending is to control people and territory. So let's see how this averages out per capita. And you can see the United States spends a lot more per capita, especially than China. Russia actually spends a fair amount per capita, even though its total spending is a little bit lower. Yes?
This spending is not adjusted for purchasing power parity, is it?
It's not.
So it's somewhat misleading in terms of showing that gap.
So, true. Let me, I'll come to that. Here's what I did to try to address that question, right? That's a great question. The reason that's important is that it's possible that it's just way, way, way more expensive to purchase one police officer in the United States than in China, right? That's the idea. So the question is China actually basically spending less and getting more? In other words, is it spending more efficient, translating into policing power on the ground? So what I did was take the global estimates that we have, and I'm sorry, there's no good way to put this graph up, and give you a sense of sort of like what
It's okay,
what
guys,
the
I
global
can't even see
variation
it.
is. It's okay. It's not actually that important. This is police per capita. And what you can see, so it's the number of police per 100,000 residents. And these are sort of all the countries that we have in one particular data set. You can see, the highest is right around 1,000. Here are the two estimates we have for China. So less than 200 per 100,000 people. So what this suggests is that China's not actually. There may be some effect from purchasing power parity, and at some point I'll probably redo the numbers and try to account for that. But what this suggests overall is that China's not spending less and getting more. It's not sort of just cheaper to purchase a police officer or the equivalent amount of sort of police power in China. China's actually getting less police power. It's spending less and getting less as a result. That's I think one of the conclusions that you can reach from this data. The other thing that I think you can see if you look at what China actually spends money on is to look at geographically where the money is being spent. And that's important because what this graph shows is local spending as a percentage of domestic security spending. What you see is that there's been a pretty steady rise from a little under 70% to almost 85% of the spending is now done by provincial and local governments. It's not done at the central government level. So that means that provincial and local governments are having to generate the money to pay for the domestic security costs. And the bottom line here is that the fiscal capacity of provinces and localities to support high levels of domestic security spending is not great in exactly the provinces where you would want it to be stronger. So in other words, the places that have the most trouble generating money to pay for domestic policing are the places that need it the most. Some of those places do get central transfers, like Tibet. But what you can see here, so this is domestic security spending per capita, and you can see there are two graphs. This is each province. You notice there's a little bit of an increase for each province. There are big jumps in two of them. This is Tibet, and this is Beijing. Beijing makes some sense. It's where the leadership is. If you're going to spend more per capita on security, that Beijing, both as an economic and a political center, is probably not a bad place to do it. What's pretty extraordinary, though, is the amount, the per capita domestic security spending jump in Tibet. It goes through the roof starting around 2007, 2008. Those numbers really start to climb. And as we know, Tibet is not...
Didn't we have the riot in Tibet in
Yes.
2008?
Yep, and that's probably what's going on in that graph. What's interesting is that Shin Jung, which is immediately the box immediately to the right, doesn't show a similar increase. And so I've spent a lot of time thinking about why that is, because if you look at what's happened in Shin Jung since about 2012, which is again when this data ends, you've seen hiring of a rapid expansion of domestic security personnel and a lot of spending. I'll show some photos at the end of some of the recent things that are going on in Shin Jung. But I think what explains what happened here is that for that 3-year period after there was unrest in Shin Jung, a lot of the unrest was handled by People's Armed Police deployments that were actually taken from other parts of the country. So other parts of the country's domestic security budget ended up supporting the People's Armed Police personnel who were then deployed to Xinjiang. So that's part of what I think is going on that explains why you don't see a jump in Xinjiang. Now, if we could get the data through 2017, I would guess that you'd see an uptick in Xinjiang as well. But what we know about how policing and unrest were handled suggests that probably other provinces picked up the tab in the immediate term until these sort of personnel expansions could get made.
Could go back for a sec. Why Shanghai? Shanghai looks like it's the fourth most rapid increase in.
Mm-hmm.
What
the
happened?
other part of this, so Guangdong, which is up at the top, also has a reasonable increase. I think part of, the other thing, if you throw these numbers in a regression and you look at what drives spending, wealthier provinces that can spend more tend to. And so I think that's probably what's going on in both of those cases.
You mean in Beijing, Guangdong, well, you could say the same of Beijing. So
Sure.
Beijing, Guangdong, and Shanghai.
Yeah, I think that's
Looks
probably...
like the steepest except for Tibet.
Yep. Okay, so here's, another thing that I think, and I mentioned this at the beginning, that this budget, this total domestic security budget, has to address both political policing and law enforcement, just sort of ordinary crime. And you almost never hear discussion of this in these articles about the increase in the domestic security spending. But crime has also increased pretty significantly in China. If you look at the Ministry of Public Security statistics, if you look at the legal yearbooks, again, every year, They document, again, a pretty steep rise in crime, particularly from 1992, which is right here, over to 2008. So the data there end in 2008 is the last year that we have the data for. And the suggestion here is just that it's a reasonable hypothesis that some of the increase in spending is having to go to address this problem and not just the rising levels of protest. Now we know protest is rising, the number of mass incidents has increased, the number of lawsuits has increased. It's not to say that there isn't more contention and potential political activity that the CCP is concerned about. The only thing I'm trying to emphasize here is it's probably not the only thing going on that the budget's trying to deal with.
What
Yeah.
are those top two?
The top two are fraud and theft.
Wow.
The bottom ones are the violent crime rates. So those are particularly the ones that are particularly driving the increase.
So
One last point that I wanted to raise, because a lot of you in this room I know China really well, and the other data point that's sometimes invoked to say, look, but China does have this really strong coercive capacity. Look at all these people that Zhou Yongkang promoted during the time that he was in charge of this system. And so what this graph is taken from some work done by Carl Minzner, who's also a public intellectual fellow, and Yuhua Wang at Harvard, that looks at the percentage of provinces that have a police chief on the provincial leadership committee. And what you see is that from, again, 2007 onwards, you see a pretty sharp increase in the political position of police chiefs. That's what that rise represents. It tells you that more and more police chiefs are sitting on provincial party leadership teams. And so, when you look at what Wang and Minzner, who are two of the people who've written about this apparatus in China, their interpretation is that this means somehow that the apparatus is getting stronger. I actually don't think that's a good way to interpret these numbers. This is probably open to debate, and it may be sort of a subjective judgment, but when we look at other non-democracies, it's different to increase the political power and the political prestige of coercive agents than it's a different task to sort of promote them in the party hierarchy. That doesn't actually necessarily give them more resources, tools, or ability to police society. In some cases, it can actually detract, because if you're promoting people, you're presumably probably paying them more, and you may actually be taking money away from frontline policing. So promoting people can actually weaken the capacity to do societal or social community-based policing and sort of ground-level public security work. So this is one of the questions that I often get. Well, look, but aren't these guys getting promoted? Aren't they more powerful? Doesn't that make them more capable? The answer is often no. It may actually have the opposite effect. And so, you can see, Mr. Zhou, in the time that he ran this system, was successful at promoting police and public security officials. But they actually didn't remember the percentage of spending stayed flat. It's not like these promoted officials were able to sort of pull more resources their direction away from other things. This suggests that increasing their political prestige didn't actually help them much with the task of policing Chinese society. So this is Mr. Zhou at his trial. What I think all of this adds up to, because I'm trying to keep my remarks under the time limit I was given, is that the idea that these spending increases may not be nearly as sort of exceptional as we think. If we look at China, we look at Russia, this doesn't necessarily look like it's sort of so different than what these other countries are doing. And we actually should expect that if we believe that democracies are somehow less coercive. We should expect that China's spending is exceptional. That's certainly the media portrayal. But that doesn't actually appear to be what's going on here. Those increases buy less coercive capacity than we might have assumed. The fiscal base for domestic security is weak, and it's actually stressed in precisely the areas that the CCP might feel most domestically challenged: Shin Jung, Tibet, and some of the other sort of both poorer, less developed, and more restive parts of the country. Both crime and political activity are increasing, and the system that spending has to deal with both sets of challenges at once. And that the elevation of police and public security officials within the CCP hierarchy doesn't necessarily help them more capably manage Chinese society. So what all of this suggests to me is that the data, if they're read carefully, may actually show us more about the limits on Chinese coercive capacity and more about Chinese insecurity than sort of overwhelming strength or an incredibly capable coercive apparatus. That's just not what I see when I look at this. And I think this actually helps explain some of what we see. I mentioned earlier that I think 2012 is in some ways a nice breakpoint in the data because this is a moment of transition. And if you're China's leaders coming in and you're looking at this data, it seems to me that you might have some real reason to be worried about your capacity to control China's people and territory. And there are a lot of things that have happened that suggest that maybe that is, in fact, how China's leaders viewed what was going on prior to 2012 and what needed to be done. We saw, the creation of a National Security Commission that has been largely domestically focused to the extent that we know about its operations. New laws regulating domestic security, whether that's cybersecurity, NGO management, and then a general sort of tightening of social control that journalists have described, that businesses have described, who are operating on the ground in China. They also stopped releasing the domestic security budget statistics every year at the National People's Congress. I'm trying to track down the next set of yearbooks to see if the data is still being released in this sort of less easily reportable form, but I haven't found it yet. And then we get the sort of, things that you all may have seen photos of recently, the sort of security theater, particularly in Xinjiang. So I don't know, how many of you saw this photo? This was carried on Chinese official state media, and it's a picture of a domestic security rally in Xinjiang, a law enforcement rally earlier this year. That's the photo from the back, looking up at that building. It's pretty striking. And there were actually a whole bunch more images like this, clearly sort of intended to display capability and sort of to impress the viewer with what's going on here. And I think that you probably don't feel the need to do this unless you think maybe people had some doubts or some questions
What's the building?
in their mind.
Do you know?
I can't remember where that is. Good question. I'll look. I'll go back and look. So again, when I look at all of this, both the data on China's domestic security spending and what we've seen since 2012, it seems to me like a reasonable interpretation. Again, like open to debate, but it seems to me a reasonable interpretation that if you look at the budget from 2012 backwards, that there was actually some good reason to be concerned if you were a leader sitting in Beijing or one of these areas that's tasked with maintaining China's coercive capacity to control people and territory. And that might actually help explain a lot of what we've seen in China in the almost 5 years since then. So I will stop there and let Steve and everybody else ask a lot of questions.
That's terrific, thanks.
Because we don't have the data for, after the 18th Party Congress, leading up to the 19th Party Congress. How can we extrapolate in some way? Are we just left to guess? We've seen changes under the leadership of Xi Jinping. And what do you think how would the budgets reflect this?
My guess would be that you might see some breaks in the data. You might actually see an increase percentage-wise in spending. the other thing that you might see is spending that's coming from other sources. So you and I talked earlier about the anti-corruption campaign.
Right.
My sense is that a lot of that wouldn't ever show up because these are the official state expenditures, and a lot of the anti-corruption inspections and work is being done in the party.
Right.
And then the cases are handed off to the court.
So that was my next question. The party expenditures are not included
Correct.
in this. And the party expenditures are totally untransparent.
Correct. Yeah.
So there is no budget that's ever.
If you find one, let me know. I'd love to do this exercise with it. To my knowledge, nobody had actually looked at this data from the yearbooks, which I was kind of surprised at because it is there by category. I mean, this is sort of a descriptive exercise of translating what's in the yearbooks and making a few adjustments to make sure everything's consistent. But I'd love to see the party data. My guess would be that it's complementary in some areas and sort of adds on in others. But I don't have a good sense, and probably don't want to get in the business of speculating about what that might look like.
Yeah, yes, it would. My guess is, given the increase of the Party Disciplinary Inspection Commission function, one would see an enormous increase in that expenditure. One might even, I think they're borrowing people now from the Procuracy and other places, so we may actually see a slight, it may be a secondment. It may kind of be like the National Security Council in the United States. It gets all these secondees, and they never go on budget in the NSC. So maybe the Party Disciplinary Inspection Commission does the same, that they stay on the Procuracy or they stay on the Ministry of Public Security payroll, and they go in that.
If anybody ever has a chance in this room, please ask them for me. I'd be really curious.
What's it mean for U.S. policy?
So I think
This kind of it's because it's not a mainstream interpretation, as you saw as you portrayed in the beginning. It's not
Sure.
what the media says, and it's not kind of what most of the people say.
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, I mean, I think this is an example for me of where academics and scholars can play a useful role in saying, hold on, there's this headline, and the headline might be accurate, right? There was nothing untrue about the statistics that were presented. But taken out of context, I think somebody who doesn't know China well could read them and come to some misleading conclusions. So I think that the first thing is just to help people know what not to think when they read a headline like that. The other thing is that this overall tightening of social control that I described has had an effect on U.S.-China relations. In one of the trips that I took as part of the National Committee Public Intellectuals program, we heard a lot about the NGO management law, which was then in draft form. We heard about it from businesses, from universities, from NGOs that had either foreign funding or foreign NGOs that were trying to operate effectively in China. And that's, concern that then comes back to Washington, it comes back to San Francisco, it comes back to wherever these businesses are located, or these NGOs or universities are operating. And so, it affects U.S.-China relations at the business level, at the sort of people-to-people, the educational level, and at the sort of cultural, NGO, philanthropic level. And so I think, that's part of the takeaway, that outside of the formal government structures, this may be a reaction that is limiting U.S.-China relations in one of the areas where they've been the most positive and constructive, the economic and the sort of educational exchange parts of the U.S.-China relationship. And if that's in fact what's happening, I think it's important to understand why that is. It may or may not be something that an external actor like the United States can change, but it'll probably, be helpful to those groups to understand where it's coming from.
The fiscal constraint, obviously Tibet is not a wealthy place. Xinjiang is not wealthy, and they can't pay for either the social services or the police activity there, but the the central government,
Mhm.
the central government is willing to make those expenditures. So when you say they're fiscally limited, they're really not.
That's true. It means that the provinces are, I think, highly constrained, and the central government has a limited amount that it spends on these transfers. Yes, it's going to put them in the highest priority areas, but I think that's also part of why you see some effort to increase the economic and the revenue base in some of these areas. There are lots of reasons why
It creates
the
a better
CCP,
tax base.
yeah, the CCP is interested in economic development in Tibet. Increasing the tax base in order to fund policing is probably not the only or maybe even the most important reason, but I think it's probably one of the reasons why economic development there is considered important.
Now, border, it sounds like it's a U.S. question, but border control is actually within the Ministry of Public Security.
Yes,
Is it-
part of it.
is
There's
it-
some part that's in the military budget as well.
Is that a broken out expense?
Yes, I'd have to look at the numbers
So,
to
so
tell
you
you
actually
exactly
would
what
know,
it is.
because it's interesting as, you know, there are lots of interesting discussions online, none, and the Chinese denying this is the case, but there's, they're now saying there are exercises being run near normal exercises being run towards, near North Korea, I think is the
Mhm.
words. Is that right? That's basically what's being said now? There was a report that there were 150,000 troops that moved up there. But
That seems to have been sourced from some very questionable South Korean media reporting.
Well,
The
except
150 number.
But then it
at
was
least.
denied, and then it was said, it's just normal. We just send people up there normally. But one wonders, you know, if there was a tragedy in North Korea and the refugee situation became extreme, you know, would they have, I guess they would make the funds available. People would need to go up to, you know, to the Northeast to work.
I would expect first that a lot of that would be in the external defense budget, that particular military region, and second, that, you know, if there really was a contingency, some sort of crisis in North Korea that required extra Chinese personnel
They'd
for
come.
stabilization, they'd probably get pulled from other regions of the country. So I'm not sure if it would actually show up in these
And it would be
statistics
years
right
later.
away. And if it did, it'd probably be a lagged effect.
Mhm. It is, I had not focused on the fact that they have stopped releasing this, and they've stopped releasing the number of protests. Was it over 10 people that
Yes,
required
yeah, the mass incident number.
that became a mass
Oh,
incident?
it's over 100.
No.
No?
Oh,
Really?
no. I think it was 10. A mass incident was defined as very, very small. And the definitions varied, but it was never 100. It was quite low. But let me open the floor to questions. Herb?
Thank you very much. Do you have any numbers or any feel for the number of prisoners, detainees, etc., who are affected by these organizations that you've described to us? That's the first question. And the second question is, what is the relationship of these organizations to Interpol and international cooperation on crimes?
So first question, unfortunately not. I don't have any numbers on the people. This project was strictly on the budget data. It would be interesting to try to get that, but I don't have the data and I haven't looked for it.
Those budgets are published.
Mm-hmm. As far as Interpol, my understanding is that the Ministry of Public Security works with Interpol on a lot of the sort of, especially transnational crime issues, and so it's, you know, in that sense, it's treated as a law enforcement agency. Pretty standard.
Am I mistaken, or is the head of Interpol now a Chinese?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yes.
in the red sweater, yeah.
Could you introduce yourself?
I'm curious as to
Can you introduce,
what was their reason to do this study? And really going back to Steve's question about the role of the state, if to speak in terms of coercion and exclude the party, which is in every office, factory, and administrative agency, seems to be incomplete.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
I'm sorry?
Introduce yourself, please.
Oh, my name is Don Devine.
Sure, it is incomplete. There are also no numbers. It's not a possible project to do. I would love to do it. It's simply not possible, at least in a fashion that's in any way comparable or reconcilable with these numbers. And I thought it was a valuable exercise to see what you could learn from the official and the state statistics about what the government is doing. It would then be valuable to add the party. Like I said, I don't know that the party statistics would follow the same patterns. I actually would expect that they wouldn't. And that in and of itself would tell you something very different and valuable, but I thought the project was worth doing on these terms. And the paper itself has a lot of places where I explain where I adjusted the figures to try, because I wanted to make them either comparable across years or to account for some inconsistency. So I tried to be pretty explicit and transparent with people about where I had questions or where the potential weaknesses of the data were. I just didn't want to get into this sort of the footnote level of detail in the talk today. In terms of what motivated the interest in the project, as Steve mentioned, I work on domestic security and on non-democratic politics in East Asia. The book that he mentioned is principally actually about Taiwan, South Korea, and the Philippines during the Cold War. I did some initial work on China and North Korea. The book was way too long and ended up being coherent when you talked about those three countries, and telling that, the anti-communist non-democracies, sort of the story of how their coercive apparatus originated and how it operated. So that was the book project, but I had a lot of questions about China. I had spent years in living and working in China and Taiwan, studying Chinese, doing research, and I found these numbers when I was looking. I read these stories. I thought there's probably something more to this. This is the best data we can get. This single figure that suggests we don't have any more information on where this money's going. And so I went and I looked in the Chinese yearbooks, and there was a fairly detailed breakdown relative to what was in the news reports. And so I thought it was just useful to basically bring that into the public discussion, caveats and all.
Okay, thank you.
Jim?
James Tunkey, really fantastic research. I want to compliment you on your work and your presentation.
Thanks.
A little louder.
I would ask if I could make a comment and then ask for your response.
Okay.
My comment is that I don't believe that purchasing parity is a good area of research, really, because I think of Chinese culture as very different from the United States, and there's been a lot of work done on differences in coercion in China and the capacity of the state to coerce, just because of the structure of the culture versus other countries. The coercive nature that really, the data that you have that's very interesting is your fraud slide. The reason why it's so interesting is because there's been pretty solid research on the decline of the state's capacity to prevent corruption. And the rise in fraud appears to be, as an armchair criminologist, a fairly good indicator for the breakdown of society's capacity to inhibit the conduct of fraud over time. And so I would agree with your conclusions and ask if you have any additional comments or thoughts on what you saw during your research as it relates to that fraud number.
Okay. Sure. I particularly, I think one important comment about what in some ways these numbers reflect. I tend to avoid talking about culture because I'm never 100% sure what people are talking about when they use that word. But what I do think you're seeing in these numbers, which is not at all surprising, is, if you think about the changes that China experienced in this period, that they started earlier, but over the course of this period, and part of what you're seeing is the dissolution of some of the traditional Maoist era practices and mechanisms for social control. You could call those cultural, you could call those Maoist. It depends a little bit on, I think that's something that China scholars could spend a long time debating, sort of what the origins or nature of those institutions was. But if you look at things like household registration, the use of the hukou system, if you look at the danwei system, the work unit, the role of the work unit, all of these things are things that tied people more tightly to the CCP. And although the party is a lot of places, its ability, those sort of institutions that tied people more tightly to the party are things that the general assessment, I think, is probably a fair one, that those weakened considerably during the process of economic reform and opening. So to me, what you see here is partly an attempt by the formal apparatus of the state to compensate for, in some ways, the weakness or the weakening of party mechanisms of control, at least up until 2012. We may now be seeing a revival of the role of the party. But if you think about what's happening in the 92 to 2012 period, the traditional account is that the institutions that the party used for sort of social regulation and social management lost some of their regulatory power during this period. And so in some ways, I think this is also a story about the way that the state is compensating for that process during this period of economic reform and growth. That's probably not a direct answer, but since it was a comment rather than a question, I'm going to take the liberty to answer it somewhat, what's that word? Perpendicularly. Yes, thank you, Jan.
Let's see, we've got here, then we got Chris, and then we got in the back. Go ahead.
I do my private research on China, but this is the first time I'm hearing a lecture on this topic.
Mm-hmm.
There seem to be many other types of activities which do not commonly occur in countries outside China, such as the suppression of the Falun Gong movement and the forceful removal of organs of Falun Gong prisoners. I wonder if that kind of cost reports would come under your, within your data, and has there been anybody who has tried to compute that? And also reportedly, Ma Yun has said very proudly to the public that his company is able to provide the government any data on any criminal who wants to commit a crime, for example, a theft or a murder or some other types of crime, before it occurs, before that guy goes to a big shopping mall, he can get the data. And whether or not there is this collaboration between commerce and the state, and is there any way to compute that figure? Also, censorship, which is very great, deleting people's transfer of articles on WeChat. Who is doing that? Does that appear anywhere in their budget? Also, I have heard repeatedly, under Jiang Zemin and also Hu Jintao and even under the current government, that the armed police have been used by the government to track down the Xinjiang Uyghur young people who murdered people left and right in different provinces and major cities in the interior part of China. And then when they found where they were in different villages, the armed police would be sent there at night and would surround the villages and would kill everybody and just bury them. And I've heard that rumors many times.
Okay, you've got a lot of questions there. That's enough. We've heard enough of these
And
questions.
also political prisoners.
We've heard enough questions. You've asked a lot. Are there any of these you want to respond to?
Sure. Most of those don't. The cost you're talking about is a societal or a human cost, rather than a sort of budgetary cost that would show up in an official yearbook. So, I think that's probably the clearest answer I can give to a couple of your different questions about cost. The only other thing probably that's useful to say, two short comments. One, clearly sort of the issue of policing and coercion in China could be a book, and this would be maybe a chapter. That might be something that I work on in the future. This paper, you have a limited amount that you can do with any given paper, and so to actually try to be focused and rigorous on the budget, that's what this particular paper focused on, which is not to suggest that a lot of questions about security policy and behavior are not valuable. It's just not the sort of the particular goal of the project, which is to interrogate this particular set of data and to find out what we can learn. The last thing I'll say is there's a lot that's been written on censorship, which is partly done by the Ministry of Public Security, partly done by some other actors, but also, done as a matter of sort of corporate policy by a lot of the companies that operate and own social media platforms. So the work that I would suggest reading that has a fairly detailed chart on how the censorship process works is the article in Science magazine. It's about 10 pages long by Gary King, Jen Pan and Margaret Roberts, that has a fairly, I think, interesting depiction of how the censorship process works and the different actors that are involved. Again, that wasn't the focus of this paper, but there's some great work on it that I would strongly suggest to anybody who wants to know more about that process.
Chris.
Thank you very much. I'm Chris Merck at APCO Worldwide. When I read the people who are writing in general about the last few years and evaluating Xi Jinping, there are some people who would argue that he represents a sharp break with the preceding 10 years, and other people who would argue that no, its roots all lie in party decisions that were directions that were set earlier under Hu Jintao or even under Jiang Zemin, and that there is a strong continuity. And I wonder if you have an opinion on that question, and if you would give us your view of how one would decide whether there has been a sharp break in policy, or whether there is in fact a strong degree of continuity.
Okay. It's a great question, and I think a difficult one to answer, especially concisely. I think one indicator I would look at, since I've spent a lot of time buried in these budget statistics, is if these patterns are very different, or if you were able to get party data and there was a discontinuity in either the government, the state spending patterns or the government spending. I think that would tell you a lot about actual policy and implementation. My sense is that there are some things that are different, particularly about the role and the use of the party, that are, if not a reversal, certainly maybe a different emphasis or a different direction. But there are probably other elements of that are a little more continuous. Certainly, the sort of some of the chief internal security concerns that the Chinese leadership has have not, they're not necessarily dramatically different. There may be, they may take a slightly different form, but I don't see that the sort of chief concerns, particularly thinking about Tibet, Xinjiang, management of some of these more contested areas. I don't see that there's been a sort of radical break. In some ways, what there's been is a deepening of policies that were in the works by 2008, 2009. I visited both the Tibetan Autonomous Region, Qinghai, and Xinjiang over the course of 2008, 2009. And I think you could see some of what we read a lot about today, the genesis of that in that period, which was 3 years before Xi Jinping was in the role he's in now.
In the back there.
I'm Tim Wen. I just have a couple questions going kind of more granularly into what's in the numbers and what might not be. Just the first question is, would paid informants, you think they would be included, be paid under the lines from the budget you were talking about? Similarly, I think you might have answered or referred to it, there's been a lot of articles about the amount of resources being brought in to surveil the internet. My guess is that those people who are being paid are not being paid out of the police budget, they're being paid out of a different ministry. And then just more of a comment that I don't know if you have any insight onto. I'm thinking in particular of a journalist, John Garnett from Australia, who for years, especially around all the Beaujolais scandal, he was looking into the matter of land, the big issue about land seizures, et cetera, et cetera. And he said that a lot of that his issue was, I guess, put in academic terms, that a lot of the coercion that's going on now between, he was saying the party and the people, was not so much political coercion, there was more and more economic coercion going on. Essentially what he was saying is that his thesis was the party in collaboration with organized crime was doing much of these land seizures, and he said the value of it actually was far exceeding in urban areas. Most of the attention was always got in rural areas, farmers. But he said more of it was going on. He was especially focused on trying to investigate those links in Chongqing, but I think he also was looking at Wuhan too. So I don't know if you have any comment, any insights into that, or anybody who's been talking about it.
I think I think his work is fascinating. He's done a lot and knows a lot about it. I'm not sure I have a lot to add specifically on that issue. With respect to the two questions you raised about, is this being funded purely through the state budget, or are there other sources? I think the answer is probably both in both cases, but with different forms. So if you think about censorship, some of it is done by the Ministry of Public Security. There's also been, and again, I would commend the article, the Science magazine article by King, Pan, and Roberts, because it goes through this very clearly, the sort of corporate self-policing and the way that the party has effectively shifted the cost of censorship into basically corporate due diligence and compliance. It's considered sort of a part of business operations that businesses absorb some of that cost to stay in compliance with Chinese law. In terms of paid informants, I would assume that some of them are being paid through the Ministry of Public Security. I've heard about some. There are probably also other ministries or other party organs that might do some of that. I don't have a lot of granular information on how that's organized, but I will say, in the research that I did on Taiwan, at one point the Ministry of Justice's Investigative Bureau, which did a lot of domestic surveillance work, calculated the number of informants that it had, but it was also very clear that they were not the only ministry who was employing those informants. How many of them are paid versus unpaid, and therefore on budget, is probably not a question we're going to get a good answer to. And I would guess that the answer is probably different in Shanghai than it is in a small village 300 miles from Shanghai. And the answer in Shanghai or in an eastern province is probably very different than the answer in Shanghai or Tibet. So even if you got sort of granular local police station data, I think you'd have to get it in a bunch of different parts of the country before you had a sense for what the actual variation at the local level, where the disaggregation of one police station's local budget. Even if you got great data on one place, I wouldn't assume that it would travel to another part of China very well.
Sheena's book is available outside for those of you who want it, Dictators and Their Secret Police. And thank you so much for coming here and shedding light on something.
Appreciate it.
Terrific.